All right. Good day to everyone. Welcome to a virtual coffee lunch and learn. Um, these started as a way for our members to just share what they've learned, what they're interested in, what they find exciting, what they want to help others understand. And it's been a really wonderful series. We um, we record these here. We also put them up on our YouTube channel. Shout out to our amazing uh, team who takes the time to make sure that these are properly edited. My name is Kirk. I'm going to be your sort of host and facilitator for today, and I'm just going to jump right in. We have a wonderful presenter here today, Lucia Cerchie, one of the longtime members of Virtual Coffee. Definitely one of our just like more involved, more supportive members. Lucia is a teacher turned software engineer from Arizona. She enjoys working with GraphQL at StepZen and writes haikus in her downtime. And she didn't mention this, but Lucia does a lot of amazing technical writing, consistently putting out good content and teaching others, what she's learned and in a way that's like really accessible. So I'm super excited that she gets a chance to teach you about what I consider to be something very relevant in the current realm of technology. GraphQL, many of us have heard the name, but it's one of those things like almost everything where it's like, I want to know more about this, but I don't know if I have the time and I don't know where to get started. So she's graciously offered to give us an introduction. And with that, I will hand it off to Lucia.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. Yeah, I want to say I really appreciate the impact that virtual coffees had on my life. When I started coding, it was in the middle of the pandemic in 2020, and I was a new mom, and I was lonely, and I needed help with my boot camp homework. And so many members of virtual coffee showed up for me and helped me get to the place where I am today, not just with my current job. They helped me a lot with practice interviews, but just with learning how to learn tech. So I'm really excited to finally be able to do a lunch and learn. I think I've signed up for a couple and then, pulled them back a couple times, just realizing how busy I was. But yeah, I'm super excited to talk to you about one of the things I've learned since starting at StepZen, which is GraphQL, and to kind of help introduce you guys to it. If you have, there's no such thing as a wrong question here. So please go ahead, raise your hand or interrupt me. I'm comfortable with that, to ask questions at any point. Trying to think. I started blogging when I was 14, so I'm very comfortable with that format, but I am newer to live presentations. So if I don't zoom in enough on a screen, or if there's anything that's making it difficult for you to understand what I'm saying or what I'm trying to present to you, just let me know and I will adjust as we go. So let's get started. I'm going to share my desktop. I'm going to have infinite virtual coffee members for a second. What is that? Okay. So we're starting out with just what is GraphQL in general, and this is what we're going to cover. We're going to cover what it is in general. We're going to cover how to write a query, and I'm also going to offer some resources to start learning. Hopefully by the end of this talk, we're all pretty good on those 3 points. Oh, I just clicked to make it go next. Okay, this is my first time using Canva for presentations. So one thing, this is kind of a common misconception out there. I also think it's a natural misconception to have, because when we name things, we name them similarly when they do similar things. So some people think, oh, GraphQL is kind of like SQL in that we use it to query databases. So it's not, right? SQL, you directly get information out of databases using SQL. GraphQL is a query language for getting information out of APIs. Sometimes those APIs are layered over a database. You can indirectly get the information out, but GraphQL does not query databases directly. All right, so what is it? It is a query language and a runtime for executing those queries. That's just right from the homepage on graphql.org. We can talk more about it. I think I should zoom in on that at the bottom. Ooh, it's not letting me. Well, there we go. Can you guys see that at the bottom of the screen, or should I navigate to the page where I got that from?
It's a little hard to see.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna exit out from here and just go to graphql.org to show you. All right, I really like this opening graphic. It's funny, my shortcut for zooming isn't working, but hopefully you can see that a little better. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the first thing that you do when you're writing GraphQL is you describe your data, and this is a good example of what's going on when you're defining a type. So if you had a project type and you wanted to hold data on projects, you could define the names of each field, and then you would define their types here. Right away, you can see that there's a string type, and this kind of comes out of the box of GraphQL. There's 5 data types, I believe, that do that, and they're like string, int, ID, that kind of a thing. And then you can also use another type in your field to define it. So if we had another type called type user, you could say, oh, contributors returns an array of users. This is how you write a query. I think we're going to start with that. But if you wanted to get information from your project, you would say, okay, I'm going to write project, and then the name of the project, since it's on the type, I can query by that. It's going to be GraphQL, and I want to get the tagline returned to me. And then that's what you would get returned. You're going to notice this pattern here where the returned JSON mirrors your query, which is something that it's kind of a major difference between REST and GraphQL, where with REST you would have an endpoint right here that would say like your API endpoint / project / maybe a name variable, and then you would see that information come back. Whereas here, it mirrors it pretty well, where you have project, and then inside project you have the tagline. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions at this point? Go back to presenting. All right, so this is kind of what I was talking about before, where you see that mirrored data. So that's when people say you ask for what you want with GraphQL and you get it, this is kind of what they mean here. This effect. So if you wanted to write, let's say we wanted to make it possible for people using our API to write this query and find a book by the title, then we would write our GraphQL schema in something called schema definition language, and it would look like this, where we would have a book type, and then we would return fields that contain information on the book, and they would be typed here. I believe I haven't shown this exclamation point yet in the presentation. What that means is that it's a required field on that type. And then you also need to define the queries that people can make. So you would define, okay, here's a query type. You just write out type query, that's the syntax. Then you would write the name of the query. So here it's just book, and then you've got the query parameter, which is a title, and that has to be part of the query because we need to retrieve the book by the title. So I put an exclamation point, and it's going to be a string. And then what it returns, that value after the colon, is book. All right, now we're going to practice writing some queries, but before we jump into that right away, I kind of getting into the weeds. Do you have any questions in general about what GraphQL is, or anything else, or GraphQL versus REST?
Okay, I think we have one question from the previous slide.
Sure.
Is the name of the query book in this example something that is fixed, or is it like a variable name that can be any?
Good question. It's not fixed.
Okay. So we just chose to call it book because like that's the name of what it's retrieving, but we could have called that anything we wanted.
Yeah, and like if I were to rewrite this, looking at it now, I'd be like, maybe I'd call that get book by title or something, just to, because as we are going to see later, when these query titles surface inside editors, it makes it a lot easier if you mention which params are necessary inside the query title.
Bogdan, what's up?
Hey, very random thought, because seeing the syntax of all of the slides, is it a JavaScript thing to use? Or is like, if we have the query, can we send it through any sort of, like, can we make requests through like Python?
Yeah, I think you can make requests through Python. My experience is in JavaScript, but I'm pretty sure it's mostly language agnostic.
Yeah.
Okay. But
as
then
long-
the syntax of, oh, sorry, Craig.
I was just going to add, as long as the language itself like has a GraphQL library or framework available, then, but each language has its own implementation of it.
Okay,
So
but
it's- Mhm.
okay. But then the syntax that was on the previous slide of the query is GraphQL, and that's you'd use that as a like a string or whatever to send it through whatever means you can send it, right?
Right. So this right here, this is GraphQL syntax. So this would need to go in a .graphql file. However, a query like this here, the book title Madness of Crowds author, that will go in a string and then go into whatever file you're consuming it in. Does that make more sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So we're gonna practice with queries starting here in the StepZen studio. And I'm choosing it because once you send a query, you can click on the schema and then you can see the GraphQL SDL that's written like behind the query that we run, which is super convenient and fun. And then also gives you access to APIs, many of which you don't need a key for. Today, I'm going to use the Ghibli API. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Studio Ghibli, but my daughter really loves those movies. And yeah, I see Bogdan likes it. They're little cartoons, and she watches them so much. Like, she watches this one with a cartoon character who's a witch, and she thinks that every day she'll go to her broom closet and get a broom and like try to ride it, and she gets disappointed when she doesn't go into flight. But yeah, so let's just take a look at this query here. That's a sample query that pops up. We're looking at Ghibli people, which is the characters. We're requesting age, films, and then on films we want a description, and then on films we're asking for species, and on species we're asking for the ID, name, hair color, eye color, and classification of these characters. And then this is actually a second query, so I'm going to put a little space to make that clear. Can you guys see, by the way? Do I need to zoom in again? Bogdan can see, Becca can see. Okay.
It looks okay, but you can zoom up by like 1, maybe, at least for the editor. Okay, that looks good, I think.
And then we've got a separate query, and this is getting films by ID. So we're under film ID, and we're getting locations with climate and name back. And then you guys, I don't think you can see, but you're on my bar down there, so I can't see what else we're getting back. I guess we'll see in the response once we run it. So let's hit run. Okay, now we're getting our mirrored data back. So you can see this is returning, I think this returns a random person, but we can double check that once we open up a graphical editor. We've got this character named Shita, and we have the description of her. These are coming back null, so they might not be present in the API. So this is a common pattern. When an API doesn't have data, you might see that surface as null. values in GraphQL. Oh, it's probably surfacing all the characters, so I'm just gonna scroll all the way down here. Past. It's interesting, getting some interesting errors. Source object for field, verifies type string, not implementing field getter. So that's something on the back end that's coming up that I will probably be digging into that later. That's not like an entirely common GraphQL error. We could talk a lot about GraphQL errors if you guys want to later. But most of the time you're going to see things come back null, or you're going to see an error related to authorization. So right up here, this is the endpoint that we're hitting to get this information back. So just like a REST API, there is an endpoint associated with the GraphQL API, and this is what we're seeing here. If I click publish, there's a couple of things that we can do. I'm not sure what I want to do first. Let's download and build. So we're going to be able to look at the schema behind this is all written out here. Hold on, it's been a while since I opened my terminal on my personal computer. So I think if I just drag this into VS Code though, that should open it for me. Pardon my computer, it is struggling a little bit today. So got a lot of processes running in the background. Okay, so now we're gonna look at the structure of the code behind this API that makes it possible for us to write these queries and get back the JSON that's mirrored to the queries. One thing that we're gonna look at first is this file. So this index.graphql file uses a directive. I believe it's custom to StepZen, where it'll pull in all the types of GraphQL files and just make those all available to the API. So that's kind of it for that one. This one is where you would be putting API keys if there was a key on this API. This is an open API, so all we have is the name of the configuration here. But you'll see this referenced in the actual schemas. So this one, let's just look at the queries first, I think would be a fun place to start. So we've got everything I've defined in one query type. This is not it's not a necessary pattern for writing your schema definitions. You can have two different query types and then write your different queries inside of those, but I find it kind of like, it's more simple to have them all in one. And we can see one, just zoom in here. One query here, we've got the title of the query is Ghibli Films. It returns the type Ghibli Films, and it hits the Ghibli API endpoint, and then we have this configuration reference here, but we know that it doesn't, we don't actually, it should actually work if I just remove that. We can try that and see. But we know that since there's no API key on this API, then we don't need to actually add configuration in the schema. Let's see, I think we'll look at types next. So here, this is something you might see inside inside GraphQL schema definitions is an error type that will return errors from the API for you, which is actually, that would be just a really good standard to have for writing your GraphQL schemas. Here we have a Ghibli Films type, and this has some interesting things going on in it. We see some standard fields and field types here defined. And then we've got this locations field, and then we're returning an array of Ghibli locations without films here because and this API kind of wanted to limit what was coming back. So we didn't want the films, locations returning films because we've already got a films type there. Does that make sense? So basically what it was is that since we're already returning a films type here, this would nest more films on it if I didn't define a type that did not have them on it. This thing here is called a directive. In GraphQL, you have some directives out of the box, but developers can also write their own. This is a StepZen directive, and what this does is that it makes a query to the locations without films by the ID that's here inside this type. And so it returns those locations without films on the type. And we can see a couple instances of that there. I'm going to go back to the website so we can open this in a graphical editor to see more of the queries, which is more of what the front end developer would be seeing. But do you have any questions at this point?
One question, I guess. So in this case, the StepZen editor generated these for us. But
Yes.
sometimes, like if you were just in, say, Node or Python, you could get like that library, the GraphQL sort of framework directly, and you could write these yourself.
Yes. What you'd have to do is you'd have to write GraphQL files for your languages to consume. So if I wanted to write, I could write, but I could also like edit these files myself too, and say I wanted to just write my own query like Ghibli weather or something by movie. I could do that and put it in there, but what I'd have to do is go look at the original API. And this is interesting example because it's a GraphQL API that's layered over a REST API. So for this one, a lot of the editing would depend on looking at the patterns in the REST API and seeing what the JSON returns. And
Gotcha.
then deciding, since the GraphQL queries mirror JSON, the queries and types mirror the JSON, you'd have to do a lot of manual editing like that.
We have a question in the chat asking about that, asking about the directives. So the syntax for directives is that @ symbol. I guess that's the first question, just confirming that. And that materializer you showed us, is that a keyword for any directive, or is that one that's built in? I think you said, so materializer is one that StepZen has made.
Right, it is. So it's not, it's @ is definitely, that signifies a directive in GraphQL. It's a little bit funny trying to write about these on Twitter and GitHub because you end up tagging people that you don't mean to. If you're like, oh, we're gonna like accidentally add like @rest as a contributor to our GitHub repo. So that's given me a couple of chuckles. But yeah, is the @ symbol indicates a directive in GraphQL. This one is a custom one that comes with StepZen. So this one allows you to use a query to return a type on another type.
Okay. And someone's asking, like, so is like directive roughly the same as a function? Or sort of like a field, but like the field is provided by a function?
That is an amazing question that I'm going to write down, and I will ask one of my coworkers who will have a great answer, and I'll get back to you on it. There are functions behind it, obviously, like making it happen, but it's a directive. And then I'll post that in whatever channel would be appropriate afterwards.
Awesome.
Cool. All right. So we're going to move away from this file for now, and we're going to move back over to wherever I put my internet. Okay. So what you saw just now is mostly the concern of, I don't know if like where in this is, I think, kind of middle of the stack, because you're not like building databases. It's whatever. Actually, if someone who has an opinion on software architecture could respond with their opinion on how, like, where API building is in the software stack, that would actually be very interesting for me to hear. But see if anybody wants to volunteer that.
Well, I mean, for us, we consider writing the GraphQL APIs as backend right now, but we're literally working on a project so that like the front end can define the shape of the data that they want, and then that becomes so kind of.
It's very interesting to me. Like to me, all those back end and front end discussions are interesting because it's always like it's relative to where you are in the stack, right? It seems like that's one of those things. It's like, well, what's to my left and what's to my right? It depends on where I am, you know. One of those definitions that just depends, which is a lot of things in software, but that's interesting to me. Eve Porcello has something interesting to say about the role of the GraphQL schema in the architecture. And what she says is that it is basically a contract between backend and front-end developers. So having to write that schema makes them agree on what data is going to be surfaced to the front end in what shape. And that just makes a whole lot of sense to me. And to me, it's like another argument for using GraphQL in a project with multiple people. But yeah, Eve Porcello is great. I'll have a couple of resources on where to find workshops at the end. She wrote the book Learning GraphQL for O'Reilly. And she really does a good job of explaining, like, from the basics what it is and then how to get your stuff done with it. I'm gonna open this in the graphical. Now what this is, what we were just in the blue screen with the queries, that was a StepZen IDE. What this is an open source kind of IDE. So what we can do here is, I'm gonna go back actually, and let's see. What we can do here is see what queries we can write by, hopefully this isn't making anybody dizzy, by the ones that we just had in VS Code. Trying to move you guys around so I can see my editor. There we go. So this graphical is for writing and testing out your GraphQL queries, and the way we write these, this is going to be more of what I think, like, more towards the front end developers would be interested in once the queries have been written. So let's see here. Okay, this is terrible. Let me get rid of that and open this up a little bit so we can see the names. Okay, so we have here, we're going to kind of work a little bit backwards and see what queries we should be able to write on the front end by what's available from the back end. So this is a Ghibli locations query, and we don't see any parameters on it. But we want to know, so we would write something like query. My query is just the name of the query. It can be anything, but that query keyword is necessary. And then what we're going to put in here is what we want to get back from Ghibli location. So let's go look at the type. Look at locations. And I think surface water and terrain looks interesting. And terrain. And then we'll run the query. And there you go. And this is an open source editor that you can put on any GraphQL endpoint. And there's a couple convenient things about it. One is Prettify. I like just having my queries all set up when it comes to indentation, because once I go to consume it, say in the front end of the fetch request, it's just nice to have, like Bogdan was talking about earlier, when you make that into a string, this is what we'd be putting into a string inside a fetch request. That would be the body of the fetch request. It's nice to have things lined up, just spacing wise. And then we get the information back, and it's an array of locations. Oh, I should have gotten the title of each location. That would make my data. What is it called? Location name, I guess. There we go. Then we're getting back an array of these location objects in JSON. So what's nice about this is you can, if you want to avoid writing a ton of business logic on the front end, you can write your GraphQL queries so that you wouldn't have to write that business logic. Like say you wanted to filter something, or maybe you needed to make a fetch call, get results, and then map those results out to a new query to return the data that you need in the front end. With a, like say a custom directive like materializer, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can do that work in fewer lines and with a little less hassle inside a GraphQL schema, if that makes sense. Do we have any questions at this point? Not seeing any. I think my chat has disappeared, by the way.
Yeah, common feature of Zoom presenting, it will hide all the chat from you. But I don't think we have any questions right now.
All right, this is it for what I had planned today, but do we have anything else that people would like to see? Because I've got, there's a few projects that are fully written out and like surfaced to the front end in our GitHub repo that I could go through, or we could talk a little bit more about your experience with GraphQL or what you would like to do with it. Some of the things that I like to do with GraphQL are, I like trying different ways to consume the GraphQL endpoint from the front end, GraphQLizing your own REST API, or contributing to open source repositories that have to do with GraphQL. If you guys want to do any of that too, I can point you to resources.
Okay, so Shannon asks, what if, so I guess going back to that query you had, it's like, what if we wanted all the locations in the mountains? So I guess like so like what if we wanted all the locations that I guess had the terrain mountain or your river? Is that possible?
So there, I would probably go here. Let's go to where the queries. So we have locations here, and I'd probably write something like this, where we had terrain, and then that was a string, right? And then let me see if that, and then what I could do is I could surface that in my own graphical editor. And that way what we would do is, since this graphical editor is built on the current deployed StepZen Jubilee API, it won't reflect this change that I made right here. I would have to install the StepZen CLI and then run up the start command to see it in my own graphical right away. But what this would look like is then putting in terrain mountains like that. And then what you would get back is the mountain, all the terrain that corresponded to mountains. Location.
Okay, so you could update the API to be like, okay, well, this is what I want to make this filterable by.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
So
I think
that's like, hey, I don't want to write that business logic, and you're like, okay, yeah, gotcha.
Nice. I think Bogdan has a question right now as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just expanding a little bit on what Shannon asked as well, because I really can't remember what talk was, but I've seen this talk where this person was complaining about a lot of stuff, but also about REST APIs, and they said something like 99% of like the errors in front ends are caused by, you get a lot of data from a REST API and then you have to filter it, you have to map it, you have to do all this
Right.
stuff to do, you have to do everything. So GraphQL solves this problem. So
It
maybe,
does.
maybe expanding a little bit on this, like filtering by terrain. What are other things? Like, can
Uh,
we do like, I don't know, can we select the first 10 or can we
yeah.
order them? Can we sort them? Stuff like that.
Right, you can do that. That will depend on whether I believe that depends on whether the GraphQL API, excuse me, that you're working with has pagination, but you can definitely return the first 10 of something and define what comes back to you in most of the ways you can think. I've been working with GraphQL and front ends I've done it with React, Next, Alpine, a little bit of plain old JavaScript, as well as there are a couple other frameworks, but I haven't used Map since I started working with GraphQL and any of those, which is Map and filter kind of like the bread and butter otherwise working with REST APIs. The other thing that is a little bit different is that you can do this, and this is actually super fun, but you could return, say you had a Ghibli database that didn't have information in the REST API, you could use Materializer to return information from the database on the same query that that you're returning information from the REST API on, which is, that's just one of the, that's why GraphQL is kind of like an agreement between front end and back end devs, because it pulls together all of the data sources and makes them accessible in like quick and easy declarative way.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Yeah, makes sense.
okay, so a couple updates from the chat. Someone was asking about the graph.com, but I think Jen covered that. So the graph.com is it's a platform that like uses GraphQL under the hood. But that's so like the power, I guess part of the power of GraphQL is like it's an open API, like anyone is free to implement it. And many languages and systems have implemented the API. So like the only rules are that like whatever you produce can consume these like this GraphQL syntax and can like return like like if it plays nicely with HTTP requests and like fulfills these requirements, then it's a GraphQL API. I wanted to ask though if you could maybe tell us a little bit like what do you think are sort of the key reasons to consider GraphQL API over a traditional REST API?
I actually wouldn't, I don't think of it necessarily as a versus or choose one over the other, because you can consume the REST APIs with GraphQL. So it's more of like leveraging your REST APIs inside a GraphQL layer. And the question is like, do I want this GraphQL layer? And for me, if I'm working on a project as an individual developer, it's like, oh, I can avoid all this business logic. If you're a team of developers, then it becomes this contract between the team of developers, and it kind of provides like a dividing point between the back end and the front end, but also like kind of a communication. It reminds me a little bit too of documentation, like writing these APIs, because but with the difference that documentation is explaining what is available to you in a tool or in a database or API, right? Whereas this basically the explanation or the what you're saying is available like Ghibli locations, it makes it so, right? So I don't know if that last thought was made sense. If there's questions about it, I could definitely talk a little bit more.
I think that's fair. Like code is documentation, right? Like you have to write very explicitly, like, well, what is allowed to be fetched from the back, and like everyone's like perfectly aware, and no one can break the rules. Like the front end can't ask for something. Like if GraphQL's, like everyone just has like, it means that the back end is for sure providing this, and the front end is for sure like consuming it, and it's explicit in a way that I feel like REST stuff may not necessarily be.
Right.
I know there are a lot of tools that will just straight up take your GraphQL schemas and turn them into like nice looking documentation. They will take all the different structures and the fields and be like, hey, here is the backend API. So that's really powerful for us, I think, for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely. I don't like saying that code or tools are magical. Like I don't like the word auto magical. Like it's a pet peeve of mine. But like things have rules, and there's, even if it takes like a long time to figure out bugs or figure out the features of code, that there's definite reasons for it all. But I will say that code seems magical in the sense that you're writing commands and then they happen, right? So but yeah.
So Bogdan's asking, I'm not sure if I can picture exactly how it works under the hood. I know if I write a REST API, I also write the SQL queries for each route. Is it the same for GraphQL? Is it a layer transporting the params and filters and options to the layer that queries the data?
Yeah, if I'm understanding what you're asking, Bogdan, you're asking something about that I haven't shown. And that would be like about the runtime and the spec, which yeah, so there's a couple of resources I can point you toward there. One is a blog post about what the GraphQL runtime is that I will pop in the chat once I get the chat back. And then the other is that there is this document called the spec, and it's short for specification. And there's a group of people who are very into GraphQL and are making it available for everyone. And they determine what becomes like what the contract, what everybody agrees is available in GraphQL. And they update it every year. I think in October it was updated, and we now have streaming available in GraphQL APIs. So I think that those two resources would go a long way to answering your question.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe just like a little additional flavor, which is the part of the concept of GraphQL is this concept of like a resolver. So, like GraphQL consumes something from the front end, and then its resolvers point to whatever you need to get that info. And I think Lucia mentioned it at the start of the talk. Like typically, it does like point to whatever DB implementation. Although, like that's one of the powerful things is that you don't necessarily have to have a single resolver. You could have multiple resolvers, right? So if you decide in the back to switch databases, like your front end is none the wiser, as long as the contract is enforced. But it doesn't even necessarily have to point to a database at all, right? Like it's just an interface. So you get to decide where your resolvers point to and like what's the behavior that they implement.
Right. And as a developer, you may be working with those resolvers or you may not be. For example, StepZen, those custom directives eliminate the need for certain resolvers, like at REST, the custom directive there. You just point the endpoint, the REST API endpoint at, you point your schema at that endpoint, and then it takes care of the rest from there. It's really hard not to make cheesy puns when I talk about that, but.
All right. Do we have any more questions or queries for Lucia? Okay. Well, if we don't have any questions right now, I will do our send off, and then I can maybe hang around for like a few more minutes if we want to like chat a little bit more. But I think what I want to do right now is say thank you so much to Lucia for putting this together. It's nice to have these snapshots of things, especially when it's everything like feels so overwhelming to learn. I have seen over the last few months just like how much effort she's put into surfacing some of these things and just like getting people aware. So I also really appreciate that. Even as somebody who just started working on GraphQL for my job, it was nice to know that there's other people in the space and they're trying to empower people and just like have them have more understanding, because it's been a helpful technology for me. And at this point, I think I prefer it over like REST APIs. Yeah, so for those here and for those who may be watching this later on YouTube, as we said before, this is part of our Lunch and Learn series. All or any virtual coffee members who would like to do one of these yourselves, we have a form that you can fill out in our events channel in the Slack, and then we help you figure out when's the best time to set this up and just like have a platform to share. We've been doing this almost since virtual coffee started, and it's been like a really fun way for us to just have another way of sharing with each other. And yeah, thank you again, Lucia, for the wonderful presentation.
Yeah. If you guys are ever, if GraphQL comes up for you at any point in time and you have questions about it, please just DM me and I'd be happy to help out. Cool.